Well, hello again. And we are recording this as a supplement because when we tried to do this past Sunday, we had some internet problems. So we were not able to record our lessons. So we will do it as we've done several others as an additional video from actually my den. And so that's what we're going to be doing today as we continue in our study of the life of Samson. The last one we did, you did not have the benefit. You will not have the benefit of the discussion or even the comments that I made, as somehow we did not get the audio on it. So it's recorded. It's got all the questions. It's got everything that needs to, that's a part of the presentation other than my comments. So this week, as we had in the past, when we've had to record it in addition to the class, we won't have the discussion that was part of the class time last week. So please bear with us on that, and we will just get started now on continuing with the life of Samson. And today we will be looking at the foolishness of Samson. This is the 7th in the series of 10 videos. And so we will now get started. Here's the scripture. O God, do not keep silence. Do not hold your peace or be still. O God, for behold, your enemies make an uproar. Those who hate you have raised their heads. They lay crafty plans against your people. They consult together against your people. They consult together against your treasured ones. They say, come, let us wipe them out as a nation. Let the name of Israel be remembered no more. It's from Psalm 83, 1-4. And as Dr. Godfrey will tell you, this is the summary of his Act 3. What does Psalm 83 reveal to us about Israel's experiences in history? Well, Israel in all of its existence has been the target of its enemies. And its enemies many times just seem to be the absolute rest of the world. And in Israel's experience, we find that the enemies, as it says here, make an uproar. They hate you. They have raised their heads against you. They conspire together with other enemies against the people of Israel, and they go against the treasured ones. They conspire with them, and we'll find that in the case of Samson. And then they basically end all things by saying, let us wipe out Israel as a nation. So here's the video.
Well, we come back to Samson now, and we're going to look at what I'm calling the third act of his life. Samson's life is given to us in the book of Judges, chapters 13 through 16. And we've already looked at the first act of his life in chapter 13, which is the appearance of the angel of the Lord to his parents to tell them that they would have a son and what the mission of that son would be. And then we looked at Act 2 of the life of Samson, which is covered in Judges 14 and 15. That act begins with his pursuit of a Philistine wife, which engages him in growing violence. But the Lord uses all of that to make him a judge in Israel. And so by the end of chapter 15, he is a judge in Israel. And now we come to this third act, which is a very short act, just 3 verses at the beginning of chapter 16. And before we start to study it, let's read it. I'll read it since it's so short. Judges chapter 16, verses 1 through 3. Samson went to Gaza, and there he saw a prostitute, and he went into her. The Gazites were told, Samson has come here. And they surrounded the place and set an ambush for him all night at the gate of the city. They kept quiet all night, saying, let us wait until the light of the morning, then we will kill him. But Samson lay till midnight, and at midnight he rose and took hold of the doors of the gate of the city and the 2 posts and pulled them up, bar and all, and put them on his shoulders and carried them to the top of the hill that is in front of Hebron. That's the whole of Act 3. But more significantly and more remarkably, that's the whole summary of the 20 years of Samson as a judge. Aside from the very beginning of his being called to serve as a judge at the end of chapter 15, and the very ending of his life as a judge with Delilah, as we're going to read about it later in chapter 16, this is all we know about the intervening 20 years. And he must have done many other things, but for some reason, in the wisdom of God, this is all that's recorded. And it's pretty seedy, isn't it? It sort of highlights again the, maybe we shouldn't put it this way, strengths and weaknesses of Samson. What is his weakness? It's his eyes. What goes wrong? He goes to the city of Gaza and he sees a prostitute and he's led astray one more time by his eyes. But what's the strength of Samson? The Lord continues to bless him. The Lord continues to use him so that he's able to get free of the trap that's set for him. And so in this tiny little act, we do in effect see a summary of what probably characterized all the 20 years of Samson. So let's look at it a little more carefully and think about each of the details, because each of them is revelatory of who this Samson is and how he's been serving the Lord. Samson went to Gaza. Well, Gaza was one of the 5 capital cities of the Philistines. So he's going right into the heart of the enemy. It shows how effective he's been as a deliverer of Israel. Israel had been oppressed by the Philistines for 40 years. You remember that's how the story begins. And now Samson has so successfully been a liberator that he can walk boldly alone into one of the capital cities of the Philistines and not be at risk. He isn't afraid. And so we see in just that one little detail how successfully the Lord has used him to bring a measure of deliverance to his people. And so we see success, and then we see his problem. And there he saw a prostitute. Samson's eyes are his problem throughout his story. And Samson is one who too often lives by sight and not by faith. And so we see his sinfulness, his weakness, as he goes into this prostitute. And now the Philistines say to one another, well, now he's in a weakened condition. Now he's more vulnerable. We can plan an ambush. We can plot a way to take him and kill him. This man who has been so triumphant over us has now given himself into our hands. This is our moment of opportunity. And they assume that Samson will try to leave the city at dawn, and so they're all prepared for him. Now, the reason they assume that is that in the ancient world, most cities were surrounded by walls, and there were gates in the walls. And the gates in the walls at night were closed. So the walls obviously were a fortification, a protection, and to protect the city during the night, the gates were closed so that strangers, bad guys, dangerous people couldn't sneak into the city while everybody was asleep. And so the Philistines rather understandably thought, well, the gates will be closed. Samson can't leave in the middle of the night, so we'll wait and plan our attack on him for first thing in the morning when he's probably going to try to leave the city. All makes a lot of sense. Now, in the ancient world, it was very often the gates that were the most vulnerable part of the fortification. Because after all, gates have to be mobile. You have to be able to open them and shut them. And so they can't be made of stone. and therefore they're often made of some more vulnerable material. And precisely because the defenders of the city know that the gates may be perceived as the weakest point, they try to fortify the gates as much as possible. And in a capital city, they want gates not only that are strong, but impressive and beautiful. So these gates must have been really something. And surely the Philistines in that night assumed once the gates are closed, there's no getting out for Samson. So here we see what appears to be a very clever, very logical, and almost necessarily successful plot against Samson and against his life. And in a sense, this represents what Israel faces. Remember, we've said over and over again, Samson kind of represents in himself Israel. And Israel, in her whole existence, was surrounded by enemies that wanted to destroy her, that looked for opportunities to destroy her. And we have a psalm about that, Psalm 83. Psalm 83 remarkably lists all sorts of enemies that surround Israel and how they conspire together, saying, "Let us wipe her off the face of the earth." So that plan of destruction that through Israel's history is repeated over and over again by her enemies now is kind of focused for us here on this Samson who represents the people, has become a symbol and representative of the people. And what happens? Well, Psalm 83 tells us the Lord delivers his people. And that's exactly what we see here, this remarkable event taking place that Samson gets up, he finds the gates closed, and in the Spirit of the Lord seems to say, this is not really a problem for me. And so he grabs the gates, pulls them out of the earth, and carries them off. It must have been just a little demoralizing for the Philistines. They must have been incredulous. I mean, this has to be a great miracle. This is heavy stuff. And yet, in the Spirit of the Lord, he is able to accomplish this and carry them off. Now, he carries them off, we're told, to Hebron. And again, it's always good to pause and ask, are these details significant details? Why is this included? And it's not immediately obvious. One of the things that may be involved is that Hebron is a significant ways away from Gaza, about 30 miles. So again, this is a great testimony to his strength. And Samson had already walked 30 miles to get to Gaza. So this is a significant trip. These distances are not insignificant when you're covering them on foot. He did not have a pickup truck waiting him to put the gates in. Another reason that Hebron might be mentioned is that Hebron is the highest city in Israel, the city at the greatest elevation. So presumably he had to carry the gates uphill to get them to Hebron. So it's another way of talking about how much strength he shows in this action. Another possibility why he headed to Hebron is that Abraham is buried near Hebron. So perhaps he's showing how God is the protector of his covenant people from the days of Abraham when the covenant is made right down to today. But maybe there's another reason. Maybe there's another reason. I had forgotten this till I started studying this story. Do you remember where David is crowned king? In Hebron. And remember, we've talked how this, in some ways, is a political tract where the house of David is justifying itself as the king that Israel needs. And it's almost as if Samson is sort of foreshadowing that Hebron is the place where solutions will come for the problems of Israel in these days. Now, that's not certain. The Bible doesn't say that. But I always find things connect in the Bible in intriguing ways. So if you want to follow that up, 2 Samuel 2 and 2 Samuel 5 David is crowned king of Judah in Hebron, and then he's crowned king of Israel in Hebron. So there's a strong Davidic connection there. And I suspect that in David's time, people read this story and said, oh, we know why he went to Hebron. That's an important place, and shows the victory, the strength of God and of Israel and of Samson over the Philistines and their pretensions. So that's Act 3. That's the whole thing. And it's the summary, in a sense, of what Samson's life has been. A life of sin and a life of service. A life of weakness and a life of strength. A life of self-centeredness, but even in his self-centeredness, still used by the Lord to serve him. And that's the end of Act 3. And so what happens next? Well, you're a quick group. After Act 3 comes Act 4. And that's what we see next, following up. So we start before he's born, then we look at his call to be a judge, then we have this very brief summary of 20 years of service, and then we come to the end of Samson's life. So Acts 4 begins at verse 4 of chapter 16. After this, we don't know how long after. We don't know whether the Gaza episode was early in his 20 years, in the middle of the 20 years, at the end of the 20 years. We don't know how old Samson is exactly. We could sort of guess that maybe he wanted to marry his Philistine wife when he was 20-ish. And that would make him 40-ish by the time we come to Delilah. I may be a little older, a little younger, but that's the rough age we're probably thinking about. And once again, the text tells us only what the text thinks we really need to know. And after this, sometime after, he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek. This is the first time Samson, we're told, is in love. He loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. Now, the valley of Sorek was only about 5 miles away from where Samson lived, so it was conveniently located. And clearly, Delilah is a Philistine. Samson is a slow learner. But on the other hand, we'll see the Philistines are kind of slow learners. They haven't really learned that Samson is going to be victorious, just as he hasn't learned that he ought to shut his eyes and stick to his own people. So we're told he loved a woman whose name was Delilah, the only woman in his life whose name we're given. But is it really her name? Because Delilah means flirtatious. So is this really her name? How many of you would name a daughter flirtatious? This may well be a nickname. Remember, we had the angel that was asked by Manoah, Samson's father, "What is your name?" And he said, "My name is Wonderful." By which he probably meant not that his name was Wonderful, Mr. Wonderful, but that his name was a wonderful name that he wasn't going to reveal. And here, too, we may not have the real name of this woman, but maybe what the neighbors called her, maybe what Samson nicknamed her, or maybe just what history has nicknamed her. But whatever is the case, it's a very apt name, flirtatious. That's who she was. And what's intriguing as we go along in this Act 4 is that we're told several times that Samson loved her. There's never a hint that she loved him. And so here is this new relationship starting up for Samson, and news of the relationship reaches the lords of the Philistines. Now, probably these lords of the Philistines that are mentioned here are the lords of each of the 5 cities. So the Philistines were always ruled over by 5 sort of co-kings that ruled over the capital cities and ruled over the regions. And they are so upset about the mess Samson has made of their lives, of their country, of their domination of Israel, that they are desperate to get even. And when they hear then that Samson has fallen in love, verse 5, and the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, seduce him and see where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him, that we might bind him to humble him, and we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver. Now, there are several important things here. One is that they come to her and they commission her, and the ESV translates it, seduce him. That's a legitimate translation, but probably the better translation here is deceive him. Seduction will be part of the deception, but the deception is broader than just a seduction. They want her to deceive him into thinking that she's in love with him so she can get information out of him. So there's a plot going on here. And it's clear their aim. They make it very clear to her. They're not trying to lure her into deceiving him and then play some kind of switch as if she doesn't know what they're going to do to him. They tell her right out what they're going to do to him. We're going to seize him and we're going to humiliate him and we're going to chain him up. And we'd like you to do that so much that we'll each give you 1,100 pieces of silver, which adds up to 5,500 pieces of silver, because I'm really good with math. This is a stupendous amount of money in the ancient world. Probably in contemporary terms, they're offering her billions of dollars, not millions, billions of dollars. This is how desperate they are. This is how frantic they are. They're willing to give almost anything to capture him and subdue him and overcome him. And she agrees. Now, what do you call a woman who seduces a man for money? We have just one more prostitute here. And again, we've seen Samson is a slow learner, and that's going to be his great tragedy here. And how does Delilah respond to this offer? We don't have recorded what she says to the lords of the Philistines, but we sure have recorded what she says immediately to Samson at verse 6. So Delilah said to Samson, please tell me where your great strength lies and how you might be bound that one could subdue you. Well, I guess you have to give Delilah 1 point for a fair measure of honesty here. And what? How many further points of liability for Samson for being stupid? But Samson's in love. Samson thinks he can trust her. Well, not exactly, though, does he? Because he doesn't tell her right away. He must have had a little premonition of what might be going on. And so we have this rather curious scene of Samson offering bogus stories about how he can be subdued. Well, get fresh bowstrings and tie me up, and then you'll be able to subdue me. And so he goes to sleep, and she ties him with fresh bowstrings, and then she says, the Philistines are coming, the Philistines are coming. Now, the Philistines are there. We're never quite sure whether Samson actually sees them there or not. But he wakes up and he breaks the bowstrings. Now, what should he have done? This is a tough question. What should he have done? He should have gone home. We don't know if Mama's still alive, but Mama could have given him advice about what he should do. And again, we see there's a sort of comic element to this story. It slows down the story. It sort of heightens the tension if we didn't know the story so well. What's going to happen? What's going to happen next? Is he going to come to his senses? Is he going to leave? I mean, she's told him everything, hasn't she? So she says, now that wasn't nice. You didn't tell me the truth. Come on, tell me the truth. How can I control you? So he makes up another story. Well, new ropes. New ropes will do it. New ropes will do it. Then he falls asleep. She ties him with new ropes. Exactly the same thing happens. Now, this is beginning to echo a little bit, isn't it? His conversation with his Philistine wife at the wedding feast, where she too pled with him to reveal the secret. Now, then it was just a secret about a riddle. Then it was just a secret that involved a fairly expensive exchange of gifts. But here, clearly, his life is at risk. He ought to be able to see that in a crystal clear way. But they're still playing games. There's still something comic going on here. So then she pleads some more, and once again, he gives her a false answer. Well, just weave the locks of my hair into your loom, and I'll be your subject. And once again, she tries it. And once again, it doesn't subdue him. And so the storyteller is now tired of comic relief and raising the tension, and now we're ready to get down to brass tacks. But we've run out of time. So we'll have to let the tension continue, and we'll come back to Samson and Delilah next time. Thank you.
All right, so we now continue with the life of Samson and learn even more about what was going on. You know, I think a lot of times we think of the life of Samson and we think of Delilah, and that's pretty much what we get, is that Delilah tried to get him to give up his secret of his strength, and that and we see it in the movie and everything, but we don't get the whole context of this story. We don't get the context of his being born to parents that never even considered having children. We find that he marries a Philistine woman against the wishes of his parents, but they went along with it. And then, of course, he meets Delilah, and it seems to go downhill from there. So the story, as Dr. Godfrey has indicated, has 4 acts, and this one covered mostly 3 and got started with 4. In what way is Samson representative of Israel in Act 3? Well, Samson is surrounded by his enemies in Act 3. He's surrounded by the Philistines. They are out to get him, and so he is surrounded, just as Israel has in its history has always been surrounded by enemies, surrounded by people who want to wipe them from the face of the earth. And of course, we find that with Samson, that the Philistines wanted him gone because he had taken so many victories away from them. He's also representative of Israel as the deliverer. Samson, as a judge in light of Israel's hardships and spiritual failures, what are they? Well, again, he shows his strength by going into Gaza, going into where the Philistines are, going in there and being in those cities that were a stronghold of the Philistines. He was strong, and it shows that he had done work as a judge, obviously, because he was able to do that and pretty much without being harmed. he was going to act as a deliverer. And as we see, Israel's hardships were that they were always an oppressed people, but they failed oftentimes. As we have seen, the theme of this is that people were doing things that seemed right in their own eyes. What are the similarities and differences between the story of Samson's wife requesting the answer to Samson's riddle and Delilah requesting the source of Samson's strength? Well, in both cases, the similarities are that those people that were trying to get these wives to get Samson to share the secrets that he had were to put him in a position where he could be defeated in terms of the riddle. He would lose the bet of the riddle. And then Delilah was seeking to know where his strength came from. And as he revealed those things, ultimately he would be wind up being defeated. We really don't know much about exactly how they felt towards Samson. We know that they never expressed their love for him. I think Samson's wife did, but not in a complete way. And Delilah never indicates that she loved Samson. Is there any indication in the stories about how each of them felt towards Samson? Consider the ways Samson's wife and Delilah were approached by men to be used against Samson. Well, in the first case, Samson's wife was threatened. She was threatened with being burned if she did not do this. Unfortunately, she wound up being burned anyway. And then Delilah was approached by men who bought her off. They gave her money to get to Samson's secret strength. Now Samson went to Gaza and saw a harlot there and went into her. When the Gazites were told, Samson has come here, they surrounded the place and lay in wait for him all night at the gate of the city. They were quiet all night, saying, in the morning, when it is daylight, we will kill him. And Samson lay low till midnight. Then he arose at midnight, took hold of the doors of the gate and of the city and the two gateposts, pulled them up, bar and all, put them on his shoulders, and carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. And this is Judges 16, 1-3. And this is the gist of Act 3. Why do you think the narrator of Judges represents the entirety of Samson's rule as a judge in a mere 3 verses? Well, obviously it tells the story. It tells the story that Samson saw a harlot there. He went into her. Again, it's the idea that his sight, his looking at something, actually created an issue for him. For if he had not looked at her, if he had not seen her, he would not obviously have gone into her. It's interesting, if we think about coveting, for example, the sin of covetousness, which is one that we probably all fall into on a fairly regular basis, it's because we see something that we want. It's because of our sight. I'm not sure that, I guess there could be times that we could smell something and say, boy, I would really like that. But that's not necessarily the same as coveting. Coveting is when you see something that is not yours and you want it. And then, of course, we find that the Philistines in this section of Scripture are, again, going after Samson. Now, in this case, they want to kill him. Then Samson laid low until midnight. And here's the thing. These doors would have been massive, as Dr. Godfrey said. These doors were big, they were heavy, and he pulled them up. But he took them, as he carried them away, he took them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. And that hill was, it was having to show his strength and the fact that he would be delivered. He was delivering them. And so we see that he functioned in the sense of a judge, which a judge was a deliverer, and he was going to deliver, and he got out of harm's way that way. All right, as highlighted by Dr. Godfrey, what overarching theme is reintroduced in Act 3? The theme of sight. Yes, once again, this idea of what Samson looked at and saw. According to Dr. Godfrey, in what way does Samson represent Israel in Act 3? By being surrounded by enemies. Where did Samson carry the Philistine gates as a demonstration of his great strength? To Hebron. And of course, Hebron was where David was going to be crowned the king, and that was a foreshadowing of Christ being crowned the king. So there's great significance of him going to Hebron. What does Delilah's name mean? Flirtatious. And of course, Dr. Godfrey asked the question, who would name their daughter Flirtatious? Well, the interesting thing is now that's not seen as what Delilah means. And we find the name Delilah is out there in some places. There's a radio personality who's fairly nice and an easy listening kind of station, and she gives commentary and so forth, and fairly good stuff. And she calls herself Delilah. Interestingly enough, she might not know that it means flirtatious. We know for certain that Act 3 takes place in the first 5 years of Samson's judgeship. Do we know that? No, we do not. Considering what you know about how Philistia was governed, how many pieces of silver would Delilah be given if each of the lords of Philistia offered her 1,100 pieces? I hope you noticed that this answer is wrong. The answer actually should be 5,500. Well, that brings us to the end of this particular lesson. I thank you for being patient with me as I tried to give a few comments on this lesson. Next week, in the next session, we'll be looking at the humiliation of Samson. So we're thankful for you being a part of this, and we look forward to the next time that we are together.